Yeah, thanks for coming, all of you. And I want to apologise to anyone watching this at home on Panlo TV. You can't see my face, but some of you might think that's an advantage. I don't know. But yeah, as Chris was saying, I am Ben Emlyn-Jones, and this here is basically Hospital Reporters Against the New World Order, which is effectively it's a blog that I've been writing for some years now. Attached to it is it's a Panlo TV, which is a YouTube channel, and also I present several radio shows as well on Critical Mass Radio and the Mindset Central and Planet X, which is sort of off the air at the moment. But that's what I do. That's basically what I do. And the purpose of the blog and everything else is because of my interest and my kind of like passion, I suppose, for things like paranormal investigation, government cover-ups, and the like the rest of you, I'm sure. And the subject I'm going to talk about tonight combines both those in equal proportions, which is why it's so important. But this is my second visit to High Wycombe, which is a really amazing place, and funnily enough, it's a town that shouldn't be here. I don't know if you've heard that, but according to geographers, it's a bit of an anomaly that a town of this size would develop in the place it has. So, oh, Santa. That's it. I don't have the details of that, unfortunately. But
so it's not the giant sinkhole, is it? Is that why?
No. I know you had one. You did have sinkholes here, I know.
Yeah, there is.
It's, yeah, and then so that's a very strange thing. But I've been to the Hellfire Caves, which I'm sure you're all familiar with.
We were there the other week, actually.
There's quite a few strange things in this town. I've noticed just walking around it, and too much to talk about tonight. But definitely, this is a very interesting place to actually be into, and I'm not surprised there's a paranormal group here. But so that was me. Actually, I don't know if you can all see that. That was me for most of my life. Actually, I was a hospital porter at the John Radcliffe in Oxford, one of the country's biggest primary care trust teaching hospitals. I lost my job in 2012 in what I consider to be very suspicious circumstances, and this may be one of the reasons I've become so focused on the subject I'm going to talk about tonight, because the person I'm going to talk about this evening, there's similarities between what happened to her and what happened to me. So that's kind of where that's kind of part of my focus. Actually, just one moment. I just got to get. I'm just going to get all my props out.
Sorry about the crisp.
No, it's all right. It's okay. It's okay. Everyone's got to eat. But this is ongoing. The subject I'm going to talk about tonight concerns something that happened 70 years ago, so it's a long time ago. But it's still, I think, very, very relevant, and there's still a lot of ongoing research into this subject, and I think the implications of it affect us all in many, many different ways. I think it's very it's kind of a revelation in a way. In a sense, it exposes an awful lot that's going on in this world, which is normally secret, which sort of came to a head, it came to a fore, if you know what I mean. This is the first time I've done this speech, so I don't know how long it's going to last exactly. My guess is an hour to an hour and a half. If I'm still here at midnight, just say, Ben, shut up. All right. But I'm going to talk. That's it. Yeah. This is something that concerns a lady called Helen Duncan. That's my favourite picture of Helen Duncan. If you look at her, she has a really amazing expression. And just look at, maybe not to see too close, but if you want to come and have a look, do so. She's got incredible eyes. This is a picture taken of her in her youth. And I think that's one of the most amazing photos ever taken of this lady. But who is she? She is a Scotswoman, and she was born in 1897 in Perthshire in Scotland. And she had the nickname from the very young age of Hellish Nell. Now, this wasn't to do with the paranormal aspect of her life, it was to do with her personality. She was very fiery, she was a bit of a tomboy, a bit of a wild chick kind of thing. And she used to she had a very, very bad temper, and she could fly off the handle, and that's something she did all her life. But she did develop a kind of a reputation at a very early age. There was something different about her. She would go into a trance in the middle of class at school and yell strange things, portents of doom and things like that at the other kids and teachers, and it scared the life out of them. But she also, her granddaughter relates that her grandmother, this lady Helen, told her that she would put her school book, if she didn't know the answers to a question, she'd put her school book underneath her chair. She'd pull it out, and somebody filled in the answers. That was a remarkable little anecdote that her granddaughter has talked about. She had a lot of children, she had a lot of grandchildren, and a lot of them are still interested in her life today and are involved in the campaign, which I'll talk about later, related to her. But even though she had a bit of a dark reputation, she was a bit kind of like, you know, everyone was a little bit scared of her. They also appreciated her an awful lot because apparently she came in very useful. There was a time when a man got lost in a snowstorm and they sent a search party out, and she went with the search party, even though she was just a little girl, because she guided them. She guided them to find this man, and she used what would now be called remote viewing, and that's how she knew where this man was. So she's a really, really interesting lady, and when she actually grew older, these strange skills she had, this strange gift, developed, and she became a professional psychic medium. And I've got a lot of respect for mediums. I've been to spiritualist churches and listened to them talking, saying they're getting messages, and I keep an open mind about that. But Helen Duncan was different. She was part of a very elite group of mediums, the physical medium. And a physical medium is somebody who can actually produce changes in the physical world via psychic means. And Helen began doing this when she reached adulthood. One of the things she did was she produced raps. Raps is noise like this, just knocking noises. And she used to produce these out of thin air. And used to amaze everybody by these noises coming out of thin air like that. Just imagine what that's like. I've experienced that actually. It's pretty spooky. She also used to produce, excuse me. She also used to produce ectoplasm. This is extremely rare. Ectoplasm is a substance which is issued from the body of someone in a psychic trance, which can form into shapes, and a lot of these shapes actually some of these shapes can resemble people who've died. And it's in a sense the ectoplasm forms into a copy of their body that they had when they were alive, which the person which hopefully someone will recognise. In fact, that often happened with Helen. And she was, as I said, she earned a living out of this, and of course a skeptic would say, well, that's what it was. It was a money-making scam on her part, so she exploited it for profit. But really, the fact of the matter is, her husband and her were both too ill to work, and they had a large family. And she had an opportunity to use her skills, just like anyone else would use a skill. Her husband was a cabinet maker. He used to make cabinets before he was too ill to die. He was too ill to work, and so she had to take over. She had to become the breadwinner of the family, and so she had a choice. She could use her skill, or not use it, and live in poverty. She chose to use her skill. So I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't think it actually can be used as evidence to say she was not real, just because she was earning a living from it. So one of the things she did was, one of the things she would do in her career, so I think from 1929 onwards, was that she would produce certain individuals when she was in a psychic trance. She would exude ectoplasm, which would form into certain people, and there was two people in particular that would always appear, or nearly always appear at her seances. They were kind of like her spirit friends. They weren't members of her family, and they weren't anyone in the room would know, but they were just people in the spirit world who would come forward and sort of assist her, spirit guides. One of those was a man called Albert, who had apparently he lived in Australia and died in 1909. Another was a 3-year-old girl called Peggy, who died around the same time. And these two spirits would actually materialise in ectoplasmic form, and they would often act as the kind of like master of ceremonies with seance, and they would often introduce the various spirits who would come forward, and then more of these entities would be produced, these images, which hopefully the person in the seance room could relate to, would recognise and be able to converse with. It's a very, very unusual situation. I'm now going to play you a little audio clip. This is something quite controversial. It was a recording, supposedly a recording of Helen Duncan, one of Helen Duncan's seances. Although there's no date on this, there's no date on this audio clip. There's no identification behind it, so it might not be. But I'll just play it anyway, so it gives you maybe an idea of what we're dealing with here. Okay, there's a short bit of silence at the beginning. This was a recording. It's not very good quality, but then it was made a long time ago. It was probably on a wax cylinder or something, because there were no tape recorders in those days. So I'll just wait for it to come up.
Thanks for listening, Hero. I want someone to guide you, but further dead, towards the corner there, to ask a young lady out. Not for Thursday. So I'm thinking that you've had an operation of some kind. Will you try for all? No.
Right, I don't know. I hope you could all hear that. I mean, it's not very loud. Unfortunately, this is on maximum volume. I can't put it up anymore. That is supposedly a recording from one of Helen Duncan's seances, an audio recording. Now, by 1930, she was becoming quite famous. She was on tour continuously. She was a hot property, and she was constantly being invited to speak in spiritualist churches and to hold seances, public seances, some of them private. And then psychical researchers started to take an interest in her. And there's a lot of culture associated with psychical research in those days. In a sense, it's kind of died down since then. I mean, now it's something that I don't think many scientists take seriously. Some universities have parapsychology departments. I know there are some. I know no professional parapsychologists, academics, parapsychologists, but in those days it really was much bigger than it is now, in many ways. And so she got on a train to. She was invited to attend. Invited to attend the laboratories of psychical researchers in London. So she basically jumped on a train and headed down south to London for an expenses paid trip, courtesy of the London Spiritualist Alliance, where she would actually take part in various experiments. And so she must have been really pleased, chance to get away. No, all everything paid for. So she did some of these experiments at the London Spiritualist Alliance, the LSA, but I think things started to go wrong very quickly during that period in London, because basically at the end of it she was universally denounced as a fraud. There was a lot of media attention on this. There was a lot of news articles published on this, saying basically she's a charlatan, she's making it up, she's not real at all. So that unfortunately was how it ended. Now, of course, the official view, the sceptical view is, well, the reason that happened is because she is a fraud. And she is a fraud, and she was caught out. But that's a rather simplistic view if you look at some of the facts, and if you go back to the original documentation. You see, there was there was a bit of an issue with her visit to London, in that the LSA had actually bidded. There was a situation where they had to bid to actually employ her for their experiments. And there was a lot of rivalry. There were several different groups and several individuals involved. And there was a lot of rivalry between the different sides. And when the LSA got the contract to do experiments on Helen Duncan, a lot of their rivals were not happy. And one man in particular was this fella. You might have heard of him actually, he's quite well known. This is Harry Price. He was a solo maverick in this field, and he's still quite famous today. He's got an official website, although I don't think he set that up himself. he died in the 1940s, I think. But there's an official website with all his documentation and all these other things on. And he was one of those passed over in the tendering process, but he approached Helen privately and asked if she would do some sessions in his laboratory, and would she please keep that quiet from the LSA, because she had signed an exclusivity contract with the LSA, and by working with Price she broke that. And basically when the LSA heard about this, they hit the roof. They were absolutely furious at Helen. They were furious with Helen, they were furious with Harry Price. Helen had been sent to London and was staying there on their tab, and there she was moonlighting with one of their rivals. And so there must have been some very heated phone calls coming through the Price's laboratory, and this of course rubbed off on Helen and her husband, and there was basically a fight. I mean, she started, Helen, as I said, she had this bad temper, and she flew off the handle. She had a very, very low flash point. She yelled at Price, she hurled abuse at him, she actually assaulted her husband because she thought her husband was turned against her. And she ran out of the laboratory into the street at some point, and she had to be coached back in. Now the skeptics have made a big deal about this. They said the reason she did that was because Price wanted to x-ray her. Now this is a kind of thing. This is the sort of thing that a psychical researcher would do with a medium like Helen, a materialisation medium, because he had to make sure that she was not hiding any props in her body. Basically, he wanted to x-ray her stomach. It was a standard practice, unfortunately. Some of the fake materialisation mediums used to hide things, you know, in their mouth, in their nose, in their pelvic region. Yes, there. Makes you think, doesn't it, what they used to go through. So he insisted that Helen had a physical examination by a nurse, and that she was x-rayed to make sure she didn't have anything in her stomach. Now, in the end, what happened was Helen, this is what you won't hear from the official stories, Helen did agree to have a full examination, and she was examined. And she was photographed in the end. The experiment did go ahead, and these are some of the photographs that Harry Price took, although someone has called these photos into question and wondered whether they are actually Helen and whether that is Price's laboratory. Okay, can you all see that? I know it's small, I'll try and magnify it a bit. That's one of them. There's another. There's a third one. So these are supposedly the photographs that Harry Price took of Helen in his laboratory. He concluded, both the LSA and Harry Price concluded, that Helen was, what she had actually done was, she had swallowed tissue paper and egg, a concoction of cheesecloth, tissue paper and egg white, and she held it in her stomach and regurgitated it. She brought it up, and that's what you're seeing there. And this is the results that he published and the LSA published, and this is what got into the media. The problem was he claimed to have a specimen of this material. He said he cut a bit off. It's a very, very small piece, and I don't know, you think he'd have grabbed a bit more of it. If you look at these photos, you would think, why didn't Harry Price grab it more? Now, the interesting thing is that this idea that she was using cheesecloth and regurgitating cheesecloth actually predates Price's experiment. Price was told this by an employee of Helen's business, a lady called Mary McGinley, who was a maid who was working for Helen at the time. And then it was after that Price did these experiments, and then he said she's using cheesecloth, tissue paper and egg white. And so I can't help thinking that maybe he got the idea from Mary McGinley, and that's just when he decided to write that. Now, the question is why? Why would he lie like this? Well, there's this issue with the LSA, as I've described, this rivalry that he experienced. But it's very, very strange, I think, because there's no kind of like explanation of the mechanism of this, how she managed to achieve this. Because you think about it, what she has to do is, as you can see in these photographs, it's a very large piece of cloth that she would have to swallow. Even if these photographs are genuine, this comes up again, that this ectoplasm is actually a large piece of cloth that she swallows, holds in her stomach, then brings up again, then swallows again. And she uses it to cover herself over, and she walks around with this white sheet over her, prances around pretending to be a ghost or spirit. That's the excavation, but it doesn't say how Helen managed to do that. She's had to swallow this piece of cloth, hold it in her stomach, make it invisible to X-rays, bring it up, swallow it again, and all without using her hands, and all without making any mess. And you can imagine, if she's bringing stuff up from her stomach, it's going to be mixed with other things, like the breakfast she had that morning. So, yeah, it would be it's pretty gross when you think about it. So, what I suspect is that basically, because of this rivalry you had with the LSA, they were basically racing them. They'd both been really badly humiliated because of their own personal rivalry. So it was basically a kind of race to the line over who had been humiliated the least. Which is why Price and the LSA published this damning report of her. But so basically, this 1930 study is not as conclusive as some people might think, as you might have heard.
It does look like cheesecloth, though, doesn't it?
Well, if that photograph actually does, you see, this is this thing. This is supposedly a photograph taken of Helen. It may not be. Helen, of course, was tied to the chair. She actually had a ligature around her wrist. She was tied to the chair. But this was used, actually. This 1930 study was used later on in the trouble that was to come, which was much, much worse, to blacken her name. And so Helen basically went back to Edinburgh again. She parted company with Price and the LSA on very bad terms. She went back to Edinburgh and she basically went to lick her wounds. And she thought, well, at least now things can't get any worse. And she was wrong. Because in 1932, a woman comes into her life called Essen Maule. That's her name, I kid you not. Essen, E-S-S-O-N, Maule, M-A-U-L-E. Can you imagine anyone having a name like that? It's so sinister. And she has a character to match. Her character is as sinister as her name. Essen Maule was a writer who approached Helen and said she wanted to write a book about her. And she said she was really, really on her side, and she was really interested in what Helen did. Helen agreed. I mean, she really, really needed to restore. She really, really needed a boost at that time. So she agreed, and so Essen Maule said, "Well, I'll meet you. I need you to perform a séance at this spiritualist church in Edinburgh. I'll need to go along and observe it as part of my research for this book." So Helen agreed. So basically, they both went to this spiritualist church in Edinburgh to be where Helen did her materialisation. Now the problem was, it was a trap. Essen Maule was working for Harry Price, and what happened was, as soon as the thanks Chris, as soon as the séance began, and this ectoplasm had been produced, Essen Maule jumped up and grabbed it. Apparently. Well, that's what the story goes. Basically, she disrupted the séance. She switched the lights on. All hell broke loose. Helen apparently attacked her with a chair. The police were called. About 3 people were arrested, including Helen, and she ended up in court. Now, this is Maule said that basically Helen had faked this ectoplasm, and she had proof. What happened was, Helen had actually been wearing a cotton slip which she had taken off while she was doing this séance, and pretended that was ectoplasm. Now this is the slip. This is the court exhibit. That notation under there is mine. That's the slip Helen was wearing the court exhibit for her trial. It's about size 12. If you look at Helen, you look at pictures of her, you'll see some more pictures of her later. She weighed 20 stone. There's no way she could have got into that. And it doesn't match the descriptions of some of the people who attended these seances either. But anyway, it didn't matter. She was still found guilty. She was fined 10 shillings. And again, there was a damning news report written about her. She became sort of like a public enemy for a while. Again, for the second time in 2 years. There were a few people who stuck up for her, like the editor of Psychic News. I don't know if any of you have read Psychic News. Still going today. He stuck up for her. But apart from that, she was pretty much trashed in the media. But she carried on working. She carried on doing these times. Skeptics like, well, James Randi, the skeptic, he calls these people unsinkable rubber duckies. So she was a bit of an unsinkable rubber ducky. But in 1939, of course, World War II broke out, and there was a lot of need for her skills and her business boomed again because, of course, a lot of people were dying in the Blitz. A lot of people were dying. We had 60,000 people in the end died in the Blitz and 300,000 in the armed forces. And in the early war, it was particularly bad, and she was basically she travelled everywhere. She was constantly working. But it all went terribly wrong. And what happened to her in Edinburgh, what happened to her with Harry Price, that pales into significance compared to what happened next. She got involved in politics and espionage, completely inadvertently. This is a common sight, unfortunately, in World War II, the sinking of a ship. And this is actually a particular ship which Helen was involved with, because in 1941 she did a national tour, and she went to various places, including a sort of makeshift spiritualist church which had been set up in somebody's home called the Master Temple. And this is in Portsmouth. And so what she would do is she used to travel to different places every night, but she was a regular at the Master Temple. What she would do is the audience would come in from below, in the chemist shop below the room, in the flat where this Master Temple had been set up, and they go through the shop, up the stairs, they pay at the door, go in and sit down. Helen would be in another room. What she would do is, this is the point about Helen. Helen was quite transparent. She would strip naked and allow, she'd have a nurse with her who would examine her, would examine all the cavities of her body, just like Price's assistant did. Price had an assistant called Molly Goldney who would do that. And this would be witnessed actually by female members of the audience. So she was willing to put herself through quite an indignity in order to try and persuade them she was for real. She would then put on a big black dress and walk through to the seance room. She'd sit behind a curtain on a chair. She would be secured to her chair, tied down, and then the curtains would part and the seance would begin. And there'd be a normal light in the ceiling when people were coming in and sitting down, but during the seance that light would be switched off, and Helen would only operate. In fact, all materialisation mediums did this. They would have to have a dim red light. And this is, skeptics say that so they can hide what they're doing. But no, it's actually to protect them, because they're very vulnerable, and bright light can harm them, and harm when they're in trance like that. This light would be maximum 40 watts. It would be dim red. So that's basically how these seances proceeded. Now, on this particular day, 1941, it was actually the 27th of May, 1941. She was at the Master Temple, and Albert came forward and he said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you that a British battleship has just been sunk." Just like that one. I have here in the spirit world 1,400 of our officers and men just newly arrived. And there was a gasp from the audience because no one knew of any battleship that had just been sunk. There's nothing in the papers about it. And now, fatefully, one of the members of that audience was a man called Brigadier Roy Firebrace, who was a very keen astrologer. He was a very keen spiritualist and a paranormal investigator. He was also an army intelligence officer. And so he I think he really understood exactly what was going on here. And he went back to his office. He phoned up the Admiralty and he said, have we lost a ship? Have we lost a big ship recently? And they said, yes, we have. We've lost an Admiral-class battlecruiser called HMS Hood. It had been sunk in a battle with some German ships, Prince Eugen and Bismarck. And it had been sunken with 1,415 men drowned. And this ship was the most powerful vessel that the Royal Navy possessed. And this was at a time when morale was very low on the home front. We just had Dunkirk a few months ago. The Blitz was in full spate. Everyone was very, very, very down. People, the body count was rising. And so the government had decided to keep the loss of HMS Hood a top secret. Even the relatives of the sailors on board had not been informed yet that their loved ones died. So this must have, like I say, Brigadier Firebrace understood what was going on. This must have marked her card. He must have said, what's happening here is Helen is actually getting information that's classified through the testimony of the dead. People are coming forward. I mean, no one alive had access to this information, but you can't silence the dead. They'll come forward in seances and say things. People with knowledge will come forward and say things in seances, the spirits, and there's no way to silence them. I mean, a lot of people have been killed because they know too much. A lot of people have. Just to stop them telling other people. But what do you do when you can't silence them? By killing them. So this is the situation she was in. Anyway, she went back to the Master Temple in November. And this was at 4:30 p.m. on November the 25th. The same thing happened. This time, one of the crew appeared. It was a different ship. It was HMS Barham. Barham was another large capital surface combatant that had been in the Mediterranean theatre of operations. It had been destroyed. It had been sunk by a torpedo. A U-boat had sunk it. 850 sailors had died. And one of them came forward in this séance. He actually appeared in his uniform, and one of the people in the audience was sadly his mother. She broke down with grief and she realised that her son was dead. And this news spread all over Portsmouth. And once again, the government had kept the loss of Barham secret, just like they had Hood. So this was a really, really sticky situation they were in. There must have been some people talking about what we're going to do about it. They must have decided just to let her keep going for the moment. They decided to let her keep practicing, because she continued to practice throughout the war. But they must have been watching her carefully. They must have had people, agents, in the audiences watching her. Now, that all came abrupt. That situation, that kind of like status quo, came abruptly to an end in January of 1944, because she was back at the Master Temple in Portsmouth on January the 19th at a séance, and there was a police raid and she was arrested. And she was probably expecting, this was like the Edinburgh trial, she was going to have to go up in front of the magistrates, get a small fine, or worse, she'd get maybe a week inside under the Vagrancy Act, which means you could be jailed for up to 3 months, but most people just got a few weeks. That was how they usually dealt with people accused of fraudulent mediumship. But it all changed, and it's almost unbelievably, this whole case was driven up to a completely new league. Out there is Helen and her husband walking to the Central Criminal Court in London. Yeah, that's right, she was actually sent to the Old Bailey to face a charge under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. This was a very old law, it's over 200 years old, this law. It hardly been used in the last century. And what follows is one of the most remarkable courtroom dramas in history. And what you think of it is going to depend on your opinion of Helen Duncan, and maybe psychic powers and mediumship in general, whether you think they're real or not, whether you think Helen Duncan was a real psychic or not. It was really unbelievable. What happened was, again, it was very much like when she was arrested in Portsmouth. It was very much like in Edinburgh. She was in the middle of this séance, and suddenly two guys in the second row jumped up, switched the lights on, reached forward and said that they grabbed the fake ectoplasm, and one of them blew a whistle, and the police were waiting outside, and they burst in, and they were upstairs. They were in the room in a matter of moments. There was pandemonium. There's these two moles that were in the audience, these two guys who disrupted the seance and got the police in. There was Lieutenant Stanley Worth and PC Rupert Cross, and it was an organised hit, totally. So, why? This is the question: is why did Helen end up at the Old Bailey facing the Witchcraft Act? Because the Witchcraft Act is far more serious than the Vagrancy Act. You can get up to 9 months in jail under the Witchcraft Act, and as I said, it was an archaic law. They basically dusted off just to deal with Helen. And on one level, it's very, very simple. Helen Duncan was advertising herself as a psychic medium. She was taking money from paying customers. The accusation was that she wasn't a real medium, and she was using trickery. She was using sleights of hand, mentalism, various other tricks to fool people. And the state had a cast iron case because she had a former conviction for that offence. And she also had been denounced as a fraud by 2 psychical researchers. So you think it was open and shut, the Crown couldn't lose. It was an open and shut situation. And what's more, when she had a character assessment at the end of the trial, she was described as a pest on society, a heartless exploiter of the vulnerable and grief-stricken, which meant that the judge had no alternatives but to send her down for the maximum sentence of 9 months in jail, which, at first glance, you might think she richly deserved. But is it really that simple? And to answer that question, we have to look at the personnel involved in this trial. Now, the prosecutor was a man called John Cyril Maud KC, and he was selected by the Crown to put forward the Crown's case against Helen Duncan. This is even though he was conducting another case at the very same time in a different court. He was in court number 1, defending a man accused of murder in Portsmouth, oddly enough. And so he was nipping between court 1 and court number 4, where Helen was, to prosecute Helen under the Witchcraft Act. And he had an assistant called Henry Elam, who sort of would conduct the trial when Maud was in the other chamber. And interestingly, the interesting thing about the case in court 1 was the man accused of murder he actually said that he was framed, and he was framed by Chief Constable Arthur West, who was head of the Portsmouth Police, and that West had framed him. Now, as you remember, West, Chief Constable of the Portsmouth Police, was the man who gave Helen that damning character assessment. And so this is another interesting parallel. There's Maud doing the 2 cases, and West involved in both of them, and West accused of fraud in the court case in number 1. What's more, the man in court 1 was acquitted. So no charges were brought against West, but he was accused of framing, and he was found innocent, which is all very interesting. Now, why John Maud? John Cyril Maud had a reputation for being one of the best barristers in the country. He had a very, very elite upbringing. He went to Eton College, he went to Christ Church in Oxford and studied there. He was a member of the Middle Temple, which is one of the Inns of Courts. Now, these are kind of like Masonic secret societies that all barristers have to join. And the Middle Temple, he was a member of the Middle Temple, which is part of the Inns of Court. And what's more, after he conducted this case, thanks Chris, he was elected an MP, which is interesting. But an interesting thing about Maud was he was also head of MI5's Section B19. He was an intelligence officer as well as a barrister. And many people in wartime had 2 jobs. They were doing their normal job and they were doing a job in the forces as well. But B19 was a particular type of department. It was the kind of department where you would track down the sources of rumours. It was human intelligence. So it was exactly the kind of department which would have been monitoring the activities of Helen Duncan since 1941. So what I'm saying is that maybe Maud was the agent in charge of the Helen Duncan case. He was in charge of managing that particular case. So they decided, they said, well, you've been dealing with Helen Duncan for all these years, why don't you now put her away? So he did. The judge was a man called the Recorder of London, who's like the chief judge at the Old Bailey. He was called Sir Gerald Dodson, and there was a letter in existence from the Department of Public Prosecutions which specifically recommended Dodson to preside over this trial. Dodson was he was a Royal Navy officer, and he was also involved in charities to do with the Royal Navy, and he was very, very passionate. He was obviously very, very emotionally involved in the case to do with the Barham and the Hood. So he would have been an easy man to persuade of the need, to deal with Helen Duncan when these ships are being sunk. They're trying to keep it quiet, and Helen is spoiling it. She's releasing these secrets. Now, managing the case was also a man called Commander Ian Fleming, who was a Royal Navy officer in the intelligence division. He's an intelligence officer in the Royal Navy. He had spied on the Spanish Civil War. He was a very, very well-known spy. This guy, very well-known secret agent. And he'd also monitored the Moscow show trials in 1933, which is why this book here, which I'll talk more about later, is called Helen Duncan, the Mystery Show Trial. Now, Fleming was also very interested in the paranormal. He was an occultist. He was a friend of Aleister Crowley. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research. Now, does the name Ian Fleming sound familiar to you?
Yeah,
Yes,
it
James
does.
Bond.
It is. It's
He's the author of the James Bond novels, same Ian Fleming, who, of course, which of course have spawned this very, very popular film franchise, which is still going today. Now, the Defence Counsel, Helen had a Defence Counsel, Charles Loseby his name was. He was not a barrister, he was not a member of any of the Inns of Courts, he was an experienced solicitor, he was also a spiritualist, and he was very, very, very passionate about it, and he was very passionate about, spiritualists and mediums have been given a hard time by the government. And so he really believed in Helen's case, he wanted to win it for her, but he made some fatal mistakes, as I've described. So the trial began, and the prosecution witnesses, this is an interesting thing because the prosecution witnesses all say the same thing, and there's the people in the room were sort of like split, some were defence, some were prosecution. They all told a very different story. The prosecution witnesses told they were lured to the Master Temple with the promise of seeing something genuinely supernatural, and all they saw was Helen Duncan prancing around covered in a white sheet making stupid voices. That's what they said. Where was this white sheet? Presumably this white sheet would be a major court exhibit, wouldn't it? It was nowhere to be found. This is crazy. The white sheet, which is big enough to cover a 20-stone woman, it must have been like a king-size bed sheet or something, which Helen had somehow hidden in her body, was nowhere to be found. It had not been retrieved during the police raid, even though Worth and Cross said they grabbed it. The lights went on. The police were in the room almost instantaneously. So where was this white sheet? It's actually funny when you consider this, because all these accusations of Helen, saying Helen is using cheesecloth and things like that, hardly any of this material has ever been retrieved. Not in seances, not in psychical research laboratories, nowhere. The closest we had got to anything like that was Essen Moor, and that size 12 slip, which Helen could never have gone on in her wildest dreams. So there's no physical evidence at all. So this is all witness testimonies. So the chief prosecution witnesses, luckily, was a guy called Lieutenant Stanley Worth, and he was the guy who was in the room at the raid. He was the mole in the room when the raid took place, and he was well known as one of these pillars. He was a pillar of the community. One of these sort of like very, very trustworthy chaps you can always rely on. He was in the Royal Navy. He was his background is quite suspicious, which I'll talk about in a minute. What he said was that he basically echoed the whole prosecution case all the others said. He said he was lured there. He said some mates invited him out to go to the seance. They called it going to the spooks, and it was a form of entertainment for them, something they did rather than go to the cinema down the pub. Let's go to the spooks, lads. And he went there, and he saw Helen. He said he saw Helen Duncan going around pretending to be a ghost, and he decided it was his duty to bring her to justice because she was a fake. And so he This is why he then called his friends in the police and told them, and this is why the raid took place, and for no other reason than that. Now, Worth's background is very, very interesting. Worth, incidentally, last thing I heard, he's still alive. He's pretty old now, obviously, but he was living in New Zealand, which is a long way away, and if any journalist from this country wants to go and see him, it wouldn't be easy getting all that way. I wonder if he apparently moved to New Zealand quite soon after this case, and he's still there today. But he's the son of a policeman, he's the nephew of a very senior police officer, he's the nephew of another, he was in the Special Branch Police himself, he was a friend of Chief Constable West, who we've heard a lot about so far, and he knew the police officer who was commanding the raid, so he was very, very closely connected to the police in many, many ways. And the dodgiest thing of all was that he lied under oath. Loseby asked him, are you an intelligence officer yourself, he said. And he replied, no, sir, but he was. He was in the Naval Provost's Special Investigations Division. So he was an intel himself. But he didn't say this. When they asked him what he was doing there, he said he was spying on his own account, whatever that means. But was he? He's the kind of guy who would have actually been employed to do this in his duties as an intelligence officer, and he'd probably be reporting to Maud and Fleming and the others. So basically the prosecution case is starting, the prosecution personnel are starting to look like a bit of a secret cabal. And there's more. And Worth actually, a man came forward who apparently said that a friend of his had bet him, in Oxford of all places where I live, he made a bet with him and said that Helen Duncan would be arrested within a week, the chief prosecution witness would be called Stanley Worth, and she would be arrested in Portsmouth. And guess what? This guy won his bet. Now this guy happens to be a friend of Worth's too. So how did he know that unless this raid was planned in advance and Worth knew a week before that it was going to happen? Who knows, maybe Worth had a cut in the bet, you never know. And to cap it all, into Helen's life comes Harry Price yet again. You remember he'd been on her case for 14 years since 1930 when he'd done that experiment on her. He was brought in to brief the prosecution witnesses. Now this is really, really strange. I mean, I don't know if anyone here is a lawyer, but Price was brought in to coach them, to coach the prosecution witnesses. Now, is that actually proper conduct in court? I mean, are you supposed to do that? This is starting to look like an attempt to pervert the course of justice to me, to coach the witnesses in a trial. A psychical researcher who's denounced Helen as a fraud is brought in to coach the people with the evidence, with the witness testimony to put her away. I mean, the testimony varied enormously between the prosecution's witnesses and the defence. As I said, the Crown's witnesses said the curtains opened, Helen Duncan was there, draped in a white sheet, it was all a big con. But again, this is the question. Loseby did actually bring this up. He said to Worth at one point, well, where is this white sheet that you grabbed hold of? You and Cross grabbed hold of this white sheet. Where is it? This was a police raid. Have you got it? And he said, no. And Loseby said, well, why haven't you got it? And he said, well, someone must have hidden it. Someone must have hidden it. This is crazy. As I explained before, it's a white sheet. It's big enough to cover a 20-stone woman. This was a police raid. The lights were on. They grabbed hold of the sheet. The police were in the room almost instantly, but the sheet was nowhere to be found. Someone hid it in that situation. It's ridiculous. And Loseby actually said these. He said, well, how do you know somebody hid it? And he said, well, how else did we fail to find it? Can you see the circular argument here? If we did this, the skeptics would be onto us like a ton of bricks. There was no, the sheet was there, and we didn't find it. Someone hid it. How do you know someone hid it? Well, we didn't find it, so someone must have hidden it. So, anyway, Loseby's witnesses were very different, and as far as I know, they haven't been coached. What they saw was Helen Duncan in the chair and a white semi-fluid substance issue from her mouth and nose, which would then form into people who had passed away, who some members of the audience recognised. There's a lady called Anne Potter, who was on the front row, who saw her mother. Her mother appeared in this ectoplasm, and she spoke to her. She even touched her and kissed her, and she said it was definitely her mother, down to the moles on her cheek. and she saw her really close up. Now this is where this is where the Master Temple was. It's in the upstairs room above that downstairs shop. That's now a jeweller's shop. This is quite an old photo from Google Earth. That's called a jeweller's shop now. It's called the 301 Jewellers. And above there that's a flat now. It's a flat where people live, where the people who run the shop live. Just like it was in the time when that was. There used to be a chemist shop down there, run by Mr. and Mrs. Homer, and they were the people who ran the Master Temple. Now I'd like to play you something actually, because I've been to visit this location. I just want to show you. Around the Master Temple. All right. So if you'll indulge me, I'll just give you a little guided tour. This is me. This is actually me giving you a little guided tour of the Master Temple. And here we are in the Master Temple. Hope you can all see that. It's not the Master Temple anymore. It's actually the lounge in the flat above the shop. And as you can see here, it's just very ordinary, very elegant, well decorated. Just to get people to get their bearings. In this corner here where the TV is, that was where Helen had her cubicle. There was a black curtain across here, and Helen would be inside sitting on a chair. Now here, there were rows of seats, and there was over 40 people in this room. You get quite large, so you can imagine there was a lot of people. This room was slightly bigger because this here is a partition. And come out here and I'll just show you. This stairway wasn't there. The stairway actually came over there. And this passageway that led down to the very shop. And people just come in here, they pay downstairs, come up here, and take a seat. This light would be switched off, and there'd just be a 40-watt red bulb on a shelf over here, which is no longer there. Often used to say, dim that light by putting a handkerchief over it or something. So there'd be rows of seats here. You can imagine people packed in quite close together, you can understand how Mrs. Potter, as I'll be telling you about Mrs. Potter later, she was in the front row. So she had her knees almost up to the cubicle. This bay here, this would have been covered by a blackout light in this window because it was wartime. But this is the original step on the bench. Now this is covered over. The present owner of the house has covered that over. But that is the original footsteps of people. Some of the spectators would actually sit on here, and they'd actually sit on this bench with their feet there, and they'd watch Helen from this side. This blackouty window behind. The current residents of this property have told me that there are strange goings on in this area. Now, I'm not the first person to come to this building because Helen Duncan, Helen's granddaughter, has been over here. Mediums have been here as well. The lady who lives here has told me that she's seen a cat. That is interesting because animals did sometimes materialise in these physical mediumship sessions. She's seen several other things like her footsteps and things like that, and other strange things around here. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the Master Temple. I'm very grateful to the lady who lives here for allowing me to come up here and have a look around. It's amazing to think, isn't it? It's changed a lot, but it's still the same. The fireplace is still there. Still the same room. Some of it is still in the form it was in the 1940s. I'm just going to change over the chip on the camera. One moment.
For some reason, you seem really familiar, and it's just. Here, you guys have been here before, haven't you? You haven't.
Yeah,
definitely.
With the Legion, I'm sure that.
Yeah. So that's what I thought. It was fucking me, and I thought, I know you.
I hope you enjoyed that little tour there of the Master Temple. As you see, that's what it looks like outside. You've seen what it looks like inside. Of course, back then it was very different, as I've explained.
Where is
but
it?
It's in Portsmouth, in Hillsey, Portsmouth. Now, one of the things that Worth said when he was on the stand, giving evidence, was that he disputed a lot of he himself disputed the defence witnesses because he said that it was far too dark. People like Mrs. Potter, who claimed to have seen her mother, it was far too dark to see anything. So they're lying, they're making it up. But the thing was, there's a contradiction here because Mrs. Potter was in the first row, Worth and Cross were in the second row, yet Worth and Cross claimed to have been able to identify Helen Duncan. They saw her face at one point, they said it was definitely Helen Duncan's face. So the question is, sure, there's a 40-watt red lamp there, it's not easy to see. Mrs. Potter, Worth denies that Mrs. Potter is able to recognise her mother from the front row, yet Worth claims to be able to recognise Helen Duncan from the second row. So this is another anomaly. Now, there's all kinds of other things I could go into, and I don't have time. There are contradictions in the preliminary magistrate court's testimonies of Worth and Cross and the other prosecution witnesses. There were differences in what they said in court compared to their police statements. Now, this was Lowsby's mistake. Right? Lowsby didn't do enough really to pull them up on that, and because he had a plan. Right, what he was going to do. He had a plan to get the entire case dismissed in one fell swoop. He was going to wait for the next part of the trial, then he was going to do something really quite extraordinary. That's a book actually, which takes all the details are actually written up in that book. It's published by the Central Criminal Court, and you can actually get the original transcripts of the court. So Lowsby stood up and he said, if Mrs. Duncan is a materialisation medium, then there is a spirit world near her at this moment, and a guide, right here, possibly waiting for an opportunity to help her. Let us call him. Yes, here, in the Central Criminal Court of London. Why not? She requires a curtained-off partition, a red light, and nothing more. And that is what Lowsby petitioned to the court. But Dodson refused. The judge said no. And so the defence appealed, and Dodson agreed to poll the jury. He polled the jury, and they elected not to. This was incredible. What Lowsby wanted to do is he wanted Helen Duncan to actually carry out a séance in court in front of everyone in the public gallery, in front of in front of the witnesses, everyone, in front of the judge. And Dodson didn't want him to do that. Also the jury elected not to in a poll. I mean, this is really quite amazing. WTF? I mean, who wouldn't want to see something like that? If you've been in that jury, wouldn't you have wanted to see?
I mean, it was real. They didn't want to. They don't want to see it.
Yeah, wouldn't you want to see that? I mean, in court, you have to pay 12 shillings to see something like that in the Master Temple. You can see it for free in court. I mean, I would want to see it simply for curiosity, my own personal curiosity.
It's like even the judge.
And the judge, yeah.
Deep down knew that she was actually genuine. They're afraid because of their background and their faith that would contradict.
Yeah, because they were under a mandate to put her away. They were on a mandate to put her away as a fraud. Now, this is the thing. Now, on one level, it's legally understandable because if you take it literally, what it means is that what Dodson said was, that spiritualism is not on trial here. Mrs. Duncan is on trial. It doesn't matter if she's a genuine medium. It doesn't matter if she's able to pop out these ectoplasmic entities at will, left, right, and centre. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she cheated that day in Portsmouth. So on one level, on a legal sort of like bureaucratic level, it makes sense. But let's face it, if she had been allowed to carry out a séance in court, it would demolish the prosecution case. It would completely demolish it, because then they got her down as a fraud who they would then have to prove why a genuine psychic medium would need to cheat. That is presumably the trial, anyone would be any fit state to carry on the trial. But why would they need to cheat? That's the question. Maud Elam, they were trying to portray her as this ruthless harridan who tricked people, as charlatan, as mountebank, who put on an act and tricked people with props and with fake voices. There's no way they could possibly successfully convict her if she was allowed. She carried out a successful demonstration under controlled conditions in court. So they had to block that. They had to block Lowsby at that point, and they did. And who knows? Maybe they even were able to rig the jury polls. That's the question. Anyway, Friday the 31st of March, there was a summing up, and the jury retired to consider their verdict. It took just 30 minutes. They came back guilty. And then, of course, the following Monday, Chief Constable West gave her, basically slagged her off to no end, and then Dodson sent her to Holloway Prison for 9 months. And poor old Helen, she was dragged off the stand shouting. She had this broad Scottish accent, and she said, "I hadn't even done anything. Oh God, is there a God?" And she appealed against the sentence in June, but it was refused, and she wasn't released until the end of her sentence, Friday the 22nd of November. But Mr. and Mrs. Homer, the people who run the chemist shops and the Master Temple, they actually got convicted of accessory. They got away with a suspended sentence. Now, June the 6th, 1944 was a very special day, wasn't it? If you know your history. There was a mass amphibious landing at Normandy in France, Operation Overlord, and history, of course, knows it as D-Day. That's what happened while Helen was languishing in her cell. And so this is the 70th anniversary of that, and it's the 70th anniversary of Helen's conviction as well. And I think this is this is really important that we talk about this a lot more now, because this is a milestone, I think. And so that's what I intend to do. That's Julius Caesar, and he's an interesting chap because this link between the supernatural and warfare is nothing new. It has a very, very long history. This guy used to consult a soothsayer before going into battle, and so did Alexander the Great. And you may know the story. In 1429, the King of France put a young peasant girl called Jeanne Roumet in charge of the French army because he believed that she was hearing divine guidance from God. And of course, we all know the story of Joan of Arc, don't we? She led the French to victory against the English at Orleans. And of course, during the Cold War, I mean, this is now coming out now about the remote viewing during the Cold War that both sides used to spy on each other. And Uri Geller was involved with that. Did you see that documentary about Uri Geller being involved in psychic spying? Yeah. There's remote viewing. I mean, have you ever seen the Men Who Stare at Goats or read the book? The book's a lot better, actually. This has a long history and it's nothing new. So now the official story of Helen Duncan is, as I said, an open and shut case. She was a fake medium. She was proven fake. She had a former conviction. She was tried fair and square. She was sent down. Good. She deserved it. But I'm offering an alternative hypothesis here. I'm going to put it to you to use the language of lawyers, based on this link between the supernatural and warfare. And that hypothesis is that Helen Duncan was a real physical medium. She was regarded as a security risk because she was able to contact people with government secrets who had died. So she represented an unpluggable leak. She was put away. Intelligence agents in the police and the judiciary framed her and sent her down. And the reason they sent her down was because of D-Day. And I'm glad she went to jail, because honestly, if that case had fallen apart, they probably killed her. So they'd have arranged an accident or an illness for her. This thing, they did it because D-Day was coming. D-Day was organised as a massive, top-heavy conspiracy, to use my kind of terminology. It was thousands of people were involved in it, but they had to keep it completely secret. There's a fake village in Dorset you can visit, actually. But they went to enormous lengths to conceal what they were doing, but they knew that it would only take one person who had that secret, all the thousands of people that died before the D-Day invasion, and for that person to come through at one of Helen's seances, and for a Nazi spy to be in the audience, for the whole cover to be blown, the secret sheet to be blown. So it's not any surprise, really, that they did this. And what's interesting is that people often said, well, surely lots of people in the government believe in spiritualism because Winston Churchill did, and that's true. Winston Churchill was a believer in spiritualism, and so there's supposedly there's this kind of climate of woo over the government, but it turns out Churchill knew nothing about it. And this is provable because there was a memo he sent at the end of the trial which it's still in existence. Yeah, he said he wrote a memo to the Home Secretary, very, very angry, saying, let me have a report on why the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was used in a modern court of justice. What was the cost of this trial to the state, observing that witnesses were brought from Portsmouth and maintained here in this crowded London for a fortnight, and the recorder kept busy with all this obsolete tomfoolery to the detriment of necessary work for the courts. So Churchill knew nothing about it until he read about it in the newspapers. So that's interesting. Now that's a modern news clip article. This was published on one of the anniversaries. But jailed. I don't know if you can read it. Jailed as a witch and branded a spy, and this was covered at the time as well by the news. The answers, I mean, the only man alive probably who knows the answer is Stanley Worth. He's not talking. The last time he was interviewed, he may be dead now, I don't know, he was interviewed a few years ago. And he maintains, he said he maintains, I mean, maybe after nearly 70 years of telling this lie, he's come to believe it himself. But he maintains he went to the Spooks for a laugh and he saw Helen Duncan there and she was just a fake. Maybe he's just doing his duty for king and country still after all this time. And I mean, there's a parallel in if you're into science fiction. There's a writer in Oxford called Brian Aldiss who wrote a book called Heliconia Winter, and I wonder whether he may have been inspired by this story because it's set on another planet. These aliens, and all these aliens have mediumistic abilities. They can go into a trance state which they call pork, which means they can. It's P-A-U-K. It's spelled. It means they can communicate with their dead relatives. Now, the government on this planet outlaws pork for this reason because they don't want anyone knowing about it. So that struck me. I wonder how much Brian Aldiss actually knew about this case. Very interesting sort of thing to think about. There's Helen there. It's a bit up. That's Helen, much older. Looking troubled with age and experience. As I said, in September 1944 she was released from prison and she went back to her old business, spiritualism. And she was the last person ever tried under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. It was repealed soon afterwards, but it was replaced by the Fraudulent Medium Act of 1951, which did make life difficult for Helen and some other people.
Could have been made for her.
Yeah, it had. And that was not repealed until 2008. And luckily there's been no equivalent since then, so that's good. But I'll tell you what, even despite all this legislation, the government has never ever come down as hard on any medium as they did on Helen Duncan in 1944. Never. Now, Helen carried out her last séance on the 28th of October 1956 at the West Bridgeford Spiritualist Church in Nottingham. Now, in those days, I've been to that Spiritualist Church. It now has its own premises, but in those days it was actually in somebody's house, rather like the Master Temple. And I went to visit the house, and no one was in, so I filmed outside, and somebody came out and they told me not to film. This was when I was making my movie about Helen. And they were quite indignant, actually. And I got the feeling, because when I spoke to people at the Spiritualist Church, there's a kind of like it's still quite a dark subject. Because I told this lady, I said, look, I'm on a public street, I'll film here if I want, and she walked off. But it surprised me that they're so worried about it. Still, after all these years, it still has this kind of effect on people. But what happened was, on the 28th of October 1956, she was at this house carrying out a séance, and the police raided again. What happened was, the police actually burst into the room and they switched the light on and they grabbed her, and she suffered second-degree burns to her chest, which apparently is what can happen when a medium's in trance and there's ectoplasm outside them. They can end up getting burnt. And so she was taken to the hospital. They checked her over and she was in a really, really bad way. She went home to Edinburgh to recover, and on the 6th of December she died. Now, it's a bit of a question mark over whether that actual police raid in October had actually caused her death. I mean, I think she was never in the best of health all her life. She had health problems her entire life. So she probably wouldn't have lived long anyway. She wouldn't have reached a ripe old age. I mean, she was 50, 58, 59 when she died. But it's always, I mean, obviously she was injured badly during this police raid. So as far as I'm concerned, I think it's as good as, it's safe to say they killed her, even though she died a few weeks later. But there's been, her supporters say she stays in contact. Apparently, she's come back and speak to people, and there's a campaign to pardon her. They're trying to. It's not had any success. It's been running for many years now. There's a campaign to try and get her name cleared. Now, the question is, though, is there a more deeper issue at stake here? This is the question. I mean, I'll just tell you that. I'll just recommend a book before I move on to the last part of this lecture. This is the Helen Duncan Mystery Show Trial by Robert Hartley. It's quite hard to get hold of. If you want to have a look at it. That's fine. It's a self-published book. Came out in 2007, and it contains a lot of the information I've used tonight, and it's based on a reassessment of the original court transcripts, which you don't see in a lot of other books about Helen. So if anyone wants to have a look at that, have a look at that. But don't run off with it. Is there a more fundamental thing going on here with Helen? I mean, I don't know whether what happened to Helen is attached to a longer-term strategic strategy on the part of the government, because you see, governments assess everything. I mean, this is maybe why Dodson wouldn't let her carry out this séance in court. It's not just to stop her getting prosecuted, but it's just you can't do that sort of thing in an official government building because of the government's attitude towards phenomena like psychics, mediums, things like that. Now, governments that you've got to understand a bit about the relationship between those who rule us and what they think of us. They are very, very concerned about any kind of change in society that might influence the way we respond to them, which might jeopardize their control over us. So every new invention, every new discovery, every new idea is always checked to make sure it's safe for us to have. It has to go through a process which it's nothing new, there's nothing secret about that per se. The government employs psychologists, they employ organisations like the Tavistock Institute, the RAND Corporation, there's various others around the world, and their job is basically to psychologically maintain us in a state where we can be governed effectively. I'm talking from their point of view now, okay? It's not my view. My view is very different. We've got to try and see things from their perspective just to understand this point I'm making. Now, they will restrict availability to certain things, certain ideas, discoveries, inventions. We were talking about the free energy before you came here, and the Roswell incident, things like that. They will restrict access to knowledge about, for instance, UFOs. They will restrict access to certain scientific discoveries that might even those that might improve our lives enormously. They will restrict access to them if they think that improvement will come with a breakdown in our relationship with them. And so you need to ask yourself, I mean, is this one of the things they've kept from us? Do you reckon? Do you think this is one of the secrets they're keeping? Think about it. Now, a lot of people go to spiritualist churches, a lot of people support Helen Duncan, a lot of people believe that when we die, there's a spirit world we go to, or we continue to exist in another form. Now, the only acceptable image that is allowed of that really is religions. That is organised religions that we all know about: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all of them. Spiritualism is not sort of an organised religion as such. It's not. It doesn't have any kind of establishment position. There's no established spiritualist church in any country in the world. There's no prime, apart from Winston Churchill. There are very, very few heads of government have ever been involved in it who will openly say they're involved in it. And why? If spiritualism is true, and there is a spirit world that is different from the heaven and hell that religion talks about, Why would they keep that secret? Why would they keep a secret? Of course, if you don't believe in any religion, then you have to be an atheist, you have to be a materialist, like Richard Dawkins, and you have to say there's no such thing as any afterlife. We are just mechanism, and when our body ceases to work, we cease to exist. That's the other acceptable view. If that's not true, why would the government be quiet? Now, this is the question, because it's obvious for religion, because in a sense, the church has built up its power by holding the keys to heaven. You know, you put your money in the collection plate, you get a blessing from the priest. If you don't, you're a bad person. You know, you can go to hell. But if this was proven true, if it was generally accepted, now I mean, what I mean by proven true is not that lots and lots of people believe in it, because that already happens. What I mean is if it became accepted in officialdom, like scientists said it was true, government people said it was true, and they you know, the Prime Minister stood up on a podium and said, "We've proved there's an afterlife. It's for everybody. You know, whatever your religion is, no matter whether you put money in the church collection plate or not." Of course, the religions then would, in a sense, they would lose a lot of their power, and they don't like it. But are there secular reasons? You see, are there secular reasons for maintain silence over this issue? That's the question. Maybe they don't want us to know about this. They don't want us. They want to keep this from us. Now, why would it? Why would a person who's not part of the church and has nothing invested in the church keep this information quiet? Yeah, it's an important thing to think about. Now, I know what motivates some of them. I'm just going to play you a little audio clip. It's not long. I've got to get it from the right place. It's 4210. It's just a short audio clip.
If it doesn't make money, they're not interested. Without money, no one had any involvement in religion. They want people to fight, they want people to. There's like wars that
He lost his faith. I want tablets.
So I didn't have time to pare this down.
yeah, true.
I know. Does someone say in the fortunately social beings, we live in communities.
Okay, now I'm just going to play a short clip, extract from this speech by Andrew Copson of the British Humanist Association. It's very, very revealing. So it's very revealing about the mentality of some people in the secular world over this issue of the afterlife, life after death, what do you call it?
So that's morality. I've got time for one more, which is about meaningless. Not that slide. Meaningless at all. This is another good objection that comes up quite a lot. You people who are humanists, how awful, how pointless, how meaningless, how dry and arid and without form and purpose is your life. Humanism is nihilism. If there is no God, no future life, and the universe is a totally natural phenomenon, the universe has no purpose. And that means our lives are meaningless. We might as well have never lived, because nothing means anything. I'm still young. I can do text speak. Is this text speak? No, it's not. Is it something else? Oh, I don't know. Anyway. Pointlessness. Bertrand Russell responded to this very well, in a sense, by pointing out that what lies behind this is a fear of death. It's a fear of death. This is the problem here. Religion, he said, since it has its source in terror, he didn't pull his punches. Religion, since it has its source in terror, has dignified certain sorts of fear and made people think them not disgraceful. In this, it has done mankind a great disservice. All fear is bad. I believe that when I die, I shall rot, and nothing of my ego will survive. I am not young, and I love life, but I should scorn to shiver with terror at the thought of annihilation. Many a man has borne himself proudly on the scaffold. Surely the same pride should teach us to think truly about our place in the world. And that's an important part of the response to this idea. Yes, okay, death is the end of our lives. Maybe that's a scary thing, maybe that can be a frightening thing, but the response to that fact about reality, if you want to live your life in correspondence with the world as it is, and not the world as you would like it to be, is not to give in to some sort of better alternative that makes you feel better, but to be brave. To be braver than perhaps you feel like being, and to confront reality and to live a better life in accordance with the facts of reality as a result. Bertrand Russell, famous Welsh humanist, by the way. For 25 years, president of the Cardiff Humanists. There's a factor.
Well, that's now, of course, I mean, can I play amateur psychologist for a moment? I can't. There's one thing I can't stand is amateur psychologists. There's nothing I hate worse than amateurs, except perhaps professional ones. But it's pretty obvious how someone like Andrew Copson, the British humanist, he's an atheo-skeptic. Now, from listening to him now, I think I know why he wouldn't be pleased if it was ever proved that there was an afterlife, because he wouldn't be brave anymore, would he? He would have no kind of. I think he sees himself as special, as did Bertrand Russell did too. It makes you kind of. It makes you kind of special. I mean, Richard Dawkins even said it was a nobility to believe that there was no afterlife. It made you. Then it kind of sets you above everyone else. It makes you feel superior. And if this Freudian father figure of the authorities ever accepted that there was an afterlife, they wouldn't have. People like him wouldn't have any meaning either. They wouldn't have this kind of vainglorious backslapping that they're going for. So, I mean, I call this MBA, Materialist Bravery Award, and I've actually sent him his, Andrew Copson, I actually posted it to him. I don't know if he got it. But, so what effect would it have? I mean, if it was accepted there was a life after death, and we live forever, and this, what we're having now is a human experience, but we're spiritual beings, all right? If that was ever accepted, it would transform this world. Our attitude to dying would change considerably. It would eliminate fear of dying or reduce it to almost nothing. We would no longer be afraid of death, people who are now. Some people are, they're just scared to die. Whether they're religious or not, they're scared to die. Some are scared of going to hell, some just fear oblivion, but they're scared. Grief, loss, losing a loved one, it would be far easier to deal with. I mean, it wouldn't be, of course it would still be sadness, but I think it would make it easier to deal with knowing, because what it would mean is everyone would know that it would represent a temporary separation, not a permanent loss. So when someone dies, you've lost them, but you will be reunited one day. So it would make it an awful lot easier to deal with. And the question is, step into the shoes of those in power in this world. Would you be able to still govern the people if they had that knowledge? If you can think how they think, if you can put yourselves in their shoes, not easy, no, not pleasant. It's not pleasant either, because I don't like them. But would you still be able to have power over the world that you enjoy presently, control, and privilege that you enjoy at the moment? I have to leave you with that question because I don't know the answer. But if the answer is, as it has been in so many other inventions and discoveries and ideas, no, we couldn't. No, we cannot allow this to be known generally among the population. We have to keep it silent and allow them to believe it in a fringe, private way if they like. Let them have their spiritualist churches, but we cannot acknowledge that it's true. If that's the case, then that could be why they did. That's another reason why they did what they did to Helen Duncan, especially the bit where they wanted to hold loads of people wanted to have the séance in the court, and Dodson said no. I mean, I tried. What I did was once I tried to revise Helen Duncan's Wikipedia page, and it is very, very misleading. It's extremely biased, and so I tried to revise it. And I read the rules. I know the rules of Wikipedia. You have to provide proper sources and everything, and I did that. I put in a reference to this book. I put in a reference to the Old Bailey transcript. It was removed within the hour. It was edited back to like it was before. Someone edited it back very quickly. So this cover-up is still going on, if it is a cover-up. I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe one day this will come out, but if it does come out, then we will find ourselves living in a very different world indeed. Maybe it'll be normal in court cases to subpoena a ghost and have seances in courtrooms one day. You never know. I hope so. Unless I'm deluded and I'm wrong, and you might think that this is all a load of rubbish, and Helen Duncan is a charlatan who belongs in jail, and it's good they sent her to jail, and it's a good job she died when she did, etc., etc., etc. You might think that. You might think I'm deluded. You might think she's just using cheesecloth. but in which case it's a very strange cheesecloth. It's a kind of mystical, levitating super cheesecloth. Or is that cheesecloth all the way down? Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yes, we have. Well, it's 10 minutes before. Well, it's 20 past 10, so you know.
Is that all right? Okay.
Yeah, it's not too bad.
Any
So,
common questions?
any questions?
Double shower once. You can have a break if you like. And we'll,
What do you think? That's a question. What do you think?
What do I think?
Do you think there's life after death?
From what I've seen, yes. I mean, I don't know 100%. I think I've got a very good reason to be hopeful. I will know one day, of course. We all will.
And what about? And what about if you have life after death, but you're in, say, the 5th dimension? If we talk about parallel universes, and say you're an old soul in comparison with a young soul, or you know when we talk about meeting up with our people at other times, you know, I mean this lovely little land where we're all, you know, supposed to be in heaven, whatever. I don't really want to go to heaven looking really old when I'm old. And meeting my husband that died 50 years before, who looks absolutely great.
But it's funny that, because when they talk about some of the plays, they say that children, some of them age, some of them don't. There's so many different views on it, of how you are. Some people say you get to choose point in your life where you're happiest and you're at that. Say that you want to be 21 again, so you get to choose. There's so many different.
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the only clue we only have one clue, and that is people who, because no one ever dies and comes back, but we have people who've had near-death experiences, which I'm very interested in. Now, a lot of their testimony is very, very well worth studying. A lot of them say things like, I had a body made of light, and I could make it any way I wanted, and I could be in it. You know, I didn't have a body in the physical form with it just seemed to be like everyone was the same age, things like that, or that age had no meaning. And in the book, it was a book by Richard Matheson that was made into a film with the late Robin Williams called What Dreams May Come. One of the guys decides to manifest as a spirit in a much younger body, even though he dies an old man. He decides to come back as a young man. Well, he manifests in his heaven, this vision of heaven as a young man. So I don't know, but some interesting. There are some interesting clues. Interesting clues, yeah.
I mean, it's like the, you know, if you talk about the alien stuff, you know, like all the different types of aliens, and they talk on 5th or 6th or 7th dimensions, there may be, for instance, I have heard it said that UFOs are quite often spotted above hospitals looking for souls.
Well, that's yeah, because they do appear and disappear, and there's an interesting question
they look for
about.
Souls. I don't know where that comes from, but there's so many different. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, but
I don't know.
Some people have like mystical vision. They report seeing flying saucers in them. Some people who take in mind-altering drugs and things like that, they actually have what you might call UFO experiences.
I've had
a
couple of things where I've thought I've been on a UFO. I mean, one has not been that long ago, and I was looking down out of. I was in this UFO, and it was all red, and I've got this people, and they were all dressed like us, and I was thinking I'd died. And I remember asking somebody, am I dead?
So you've actually projected almost
Yeah, and there it was. And I could see them all, and then I was moved into another room and told, and I can't, it's a bit further, but I remember looking out of this blooming domed window. You know, domed window, and seeing us go very close, above the land. And seeing people.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very weird.
Yeah, one question. Going back to the history of Helen Duncan, was this incident where she seemed to know about souls who had been killed on HMS Hood. I noticed there was a slight discrepancy. One figure was 1,400, another one was 1,500. I think it's 1,500 that have actually killed, but it wasn't
Oh, right.
400 that she said have been killed. But what was the... Was that the only incident where she seemed to have heard mysteriously of an actual happening? And if so, I mean, how close was she?
Well, from what I've seen, I mean, it seems very, very accurate. I mean, she named the ship. She got quite.
So she named the ship.
Yeah.
Right.
In both cases, they named the ship. It's happened twice with the HMS Barham and HMS Hood, within a few months of each other. The casualty is Albert, who this spirit guide who appeared and gave the news, said it was 1400. It was 1412, I believe, who actually went down in the end. In the case of the Barham, a sailor from the Barham actually appeared, according to reports. And again, it seems she got the name of the ship right, and also the casualty was 850.
Right.
So the question is, I mean, if she was faking it, she must have had access to classified information by some other way, which included maybe what the number of people who died, which may not even been known at the time. Joe, it's an interesting question. It seems hard. I think obviously it seems hard to imagine how that could have happened. What's more, high up in government, they also didn't. They also must have thought whether she was real or not. In a sense, is not the point. As the point is that they thought she was real.
Enough to make them worried.
Yeah, they thought she was real. That's the thing. They
But
thought
she
she
had
was
no
real.
links. None of her family members had any links to do with the government that she could have got information. There was no proven links or relatives or friends or someone working with her.
It
That's
can't be
what I'm saying,
ruled
but
out. I don't think
that
I don't see how you can
should
rule
come
that
out
out.
at all. I'm not saying that. I firmly for one believe in,
Yeah.
and I'm actually going to see Sally Morgan next week, and I think she's genuine.
Yeah.
100%. But I'm just wondering, with Helen, has anyone doing an investigation to see if she had family members or friends, that could be worked, because in that time, in that era with the war, everyone, it said, was doing more than one job. People had access to things that they probably wouldn't have access today because it's all sort of closed down and tight. But then everyone had to be an ally, everyone had to be, on point because it was such a war effort. Everyone had to.
Yes, I mean,
Was in Portsmouth.
a sceptical view of mediums say that they do try to find information ahead.
Hot reading, yeah.
Hot
They call it hot reading, yeah.
Yeah, and it may be she found some source, a couple of sources where she thought, hey, I'm onto a good thing here. They could give her the information quickly, presumably by telephone.
That can't be ruled out. I mean,
Now,
it can't be
if
ruled
they
out
looked
something.
into it, if they even eliminated it, then they can't.
But
say.
it was highly classified information. I mean, Firebrace was like this senior brigadier intelligence officer. He only found out. I mean, he had to call the Admiralty himself and talk to someone who knew to find out. But it can't be ruled out. That it can't be. Although it seems, my own view after studying it is that she knew things like, for instance, the casualty list, which may not even have been published, even the people who knew the ship had gone down, because this happened quite recently. She actually announced the sinkings very soon after they happened, sometimes within hours after they happened. Yeah, she got the casualty list correct, which that wouldn't even have been known at the time.
Because if she was in that place, she had no time to run around and get the information. Another thing.
Yeah, I mean,
that
that's
time span was really short.
Exactly. So it seems unlikely. It does seem unlikely.
Yes, what you're saying about the government plays things like the Tavistock Institute, assessing whether or not things could be allowed, as to whether they might affect the government's relationship with the public.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the thing that made I thought of was subliminal advertising, because it was brought in the 1950s, and advertisers thought it might work, and people, of course, were advertising to advertisers. We've got this wonderful new system, subliminal advertising, bypassing people's conscious mind. And the governments, the American and British governments, clamped down on it, said, no, it's not going to be allowed. In fact, subsequent research shows that it may not work anyway.
But I mean, that's a good example, another good example of how if they consider something, you know, hazardous in any way, they will say you're not having it. They'll have ways and means of shutting it down through various techniques they use to shut it down, through control of scientific establishments, through control of the media, and the political world, things like that.
This is what we're saying about communication. There's a lot of that's another thing.
Anybody else?
Portsmouth.
Say anything?
Portsmouth as well. Yeah.
Okay, well, I just want to say thanks for inviting me here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Ben. And,
Glad you enjoyed it, and
excellent. Sure.
hope to see you again. Well, hope to see you. I know I'm going to hang around with you for a bit longer, but if you ever want me back here, let me know.
Yes, thank
I'll
you
tell you
very
about the
much.
zombies. That's good. Thank you.
You should just come on to the group meeting. Neil puts them on Facebook, so if you see one that kind of